All right, everyone. This is the screencast over the Middle Ages, specifically in how it deals with the medieval period of literature. Before I start talking to you about this, I want you to make sure that you have the handout that goes with this. These are basically like the fill-in-the-blank notes that we had over the medieval period. If you don't have them with you, I want you to go to the Weebly page. You're going to click on Semester 1, and then you're going to scroll down. Make sure you're under Materials and Documents, and you're going to go right down here where it says Middle Ages Note Sheet. You're going to click on that, and it will open up a document that looks like this. Okay? This is the sheet that you need to go along with this. So pause if you don't have this sheet right now. Pause really quick and get this sheet to yourself, and then push play again. All right. So enough of that. Let's go back and talk. So you have the Middle Ages, and essentially this is going to be from 500 to 1500 AD. Now, I know this overlaps somewhat with the Anglo-Saxon period, but that's because there is a point in time in any period of either history or literature where there's going to be an overlap, because this is where things are really evolving, where things are really changing. So if you need something to help you set this in your mind, think of it like this. When Beowulf was fighting Grendel, it was the Anglo-Saxon period. But by the time this story had passed down for years and years and years and years and years, it was the early Middle Ages, okay? That's when it was turning over. So let's just talk about what the Middle Ages are, okay? You have really just, this represents like a period in time in European history. So that's all of Europe, or the most parts of Europe. I told y'all when we talked about the Anglo-Saxon period that the Roman Empire fell, and then in came the Angles and the Saxons and the Danes and the Utes and all of them, and they came over to take over. So the Anglo-Saxon period really is still in the Middle Ages, but it's just a literary period within the Middle Ages. So I would say that probably Anglo-Saxon period is going to cover the early Middle Ages. The literature that we are about to cover is really going to be more placed in the high and late periods of the Middle Ages. So the three periods of the Middle Ages: early, high, and late. They call it high Middle Ages because no one's really going to be like, it was the Middle Ages. It's just wordy. Some people will call it low, high, and late, kind of like a bell curve. Just remember that it's starting, it's in the thick of it, and then the end. So anyhow, anything that comes from the Middle Ages, like whether it be fashion or weaponry or food, it is described as being medieval. So the word medieval is an adjective that describes things or concepts or people that come from the Middle Ages. Okay, so sometimes you will even hear it called the medieval period, right? So that's just sometimes used synonymously. Synonymously being synonyms, right? The words can use interchange with each other. Now, a lot of times people view this time as the Dark Ages. Here's why. The Renaissance period comes after this, and then comes Enlightenment. And this is when creativity and art, like literal art, like paintings and drawings and sculptures, and then like the dramatic arts, like dramas and poetry, all of that. Those things start to emerge, and people start to have an emphasis on being educated, and educating the masses, really. This whole idea of finding the beauty in life, or turning on the lights to creativity, those ideas are really born in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. And so any time before then is viewed as the Dark Ages. Think of it like that's before the lights came on in people's creative minds. Okay? So there are 3 different estates in the Middle Ages. Now, estate is just a way to like draw a category. So let's just think of it like there are 3 different categories of people within the Middle Ages. You have clergy, nobles, and commoners. Okay? So, clergy is a name for people who have positions within religion, within a church. At this time, everyone is religious, primarily Catholic. It's not until much later that we see the emergence of like Lutheran or Protestant, but like primarily everyone is Catholic at this time. And so the clergy that we're talking about during this time, their whole purpose is to save people, to help people, to further the kingdom of God. And so I like to call this group those who pray. Okay? So these people typically are going to speak Latin. Now, that is because traditional Catholic masses were given in Latin oftentimes. So, now, I wouldn't say that they speak solely Latin, but definitely they have command of that language. Then you have the nobles. Think of these people as like royalty, okay? So these are the people who are to protect us, to allow everyone to work in peace, and to provide justice. So this is someone who can fight for others, someone who can command people to fight for others, and someone for whom others fight. Meaning kings, lords, knights, all of these people, they are those who fight. Okay, the nobles. You have to be born into nobility. You can't just decide to be a noble. You're either born of a noble family or you're born of a common family. Now, commoners, I'm sorry, I didn't cover this. Mostly French is spoken between nobles. Now, I will tell you this. Nobles will probably know Latin as well because they're wealthy and they have access to education, and they often deal with the church, and so they probably know Latin. Likewise, the church probably knows French, okay, because they deal with the nobles. They may also know English, but they may also feel like English is a language for common people and would not put forth any effort to learn it. So, it just kind of depends on geographically where that falls. Commoners are going to speak mostly English. So sorry about that. Predominantly. This group of people, their purpose is to feed and clothe and serve all of them. Everyone above them. The nobles, the clergy, everyone. This is the group of people who, work with metal, like blacksmiths. These are people who farm lands, like a parson who might run a plow, so he might be like a preacher, and he might run a plow. Then there's also stuff like, someone who kind of makes hats, or someone who's a handmaiden who will sew things. All of these people are peasants, and they are those who work. You will not see anything in between for quite some time. In fact, there is a major crisis that hits the continent of Europe that later on changes this and pretty much begins the idea of a middle class. But at this point, there is no middle class. You're either wealthy and noble, or poor and common. Okay? To review, Latin is spoken in church and schools, French is spoken in court and castle, and English is the language of the commoners. I want to talk to you for a moment about the social structure and the hierarchy of power in this society. We call this feudalism. It's essentially a system that breaks people up by property, military, and social behavior. Okay? So before I talk to you about divine right, let me just review this idea of the hierarchy, okay? You have God, Pope, King, landowners, knights, and serfs, okay? Now, this is the order of power. Truthfully, the king, while he's quite a bit below the Pope here, he's really only about, just right close to him, right close to the Pope. Because everyone is Catholic, they all accept the fact that God is the head of all, and no one is above God. And so therefore, since the king himself would be Catholic, he would put himself below the Pope, but only just so, because he would accept that if God is the head of all, then the Pope, who is the head of the church and the voice of God, so to speak, he would have to be underneath the Pope. He would not be underneath any other rank within the church, only the Pope. He would be nearly even, but just barely under the Pope, because he is Catholic. Then you have the king. And then you have landowners. These are people who are lords and ladies. And then you have knights. And then you have serfs, which are essentially peasants. Okay? Now, just as a heads up, I may use the term lord synonymously with landowner, because the highest position of wealth in this society, other than being a king, would be to be a landowner. Okay? Only noble people owned land, and that was their profession, was to just own land. No land was owned by peasants, by serfs. Everyone who was not noble lived on a noble person's patch of land. Okay? So, King Henry, I believe it was King Henry II. Again, this is English, so forgive me if there is a little bit of fact-checking that I didn't get right. But I believe it was King Henry II who decided that this hierarchy of power was called divine right. This just means that since God knows everything, he would know what a person would do once that person got into a position of power. And since he let them get into that position of power, then he obviously agrees with them. And so therefore, anyone in power, you should obey. Now, in our time, we can look at that idea and see that there's a potential for corruption, right? Because we understand that some people in society would use opportunities to behave poorly, all right, or to put people in a position against the church or against their own freedoms. You're going to see some conflict between king and church during this time. There are problems with both, but I will tell you that during this time there is a lot of implied indictment of the church. For example, you have the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. He wrote this as a satire in order to expose injustices and corruption within the church. Because during this time, he could not tell people, oh, the church is bad or the church is corrupt. He would have to kind of slide that in. So, what's unique about this situation is that you have knights right below landowners who are peasants. And so knights are actually the only part of this system that can move up. For example, you have, say you have a knight in a kingdom who's done something really amazing. Perhaps this knight has done some favor to the king and won a great battle. Okay, it's possible that the king would reward this knight with land, which would then make that knight no longer a knight but now a lord. Okay, so this is the only vertical movement that happens within this hierarchy of power. Since that happens, knights are kind of a special group of people during this time. And they essentially are like people who were identified at an early age to be warriors. And they would be loyal to their landowner no matter what. And again, landowner is like a lord or a lady. Now, let me tell you, because they are around people that were their equal or a higher level of them, they had to come up with a code of conduct, like a way to behave, so that they could make sure that they were behaving properly around nobles. And this is called chivalry. Okay? It consists of loyalty to one's landowner, to his lord, essentially, obeying the rules of war, like fighting in a manner that brings honor, and adoration of a lady, which is not necessarily someone that you're married to, but someone that maybe has a higher status than you and could definitely help boost your status, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of ideals in chivalry that are still alive today. So think of things that you see men do for women today that seems like it's chivalrous. Can you think of anything a man does for a lady today? What comes to mind for me are things like holding open the door, pulling out a chair, taking off the hat or tipping the hat. I had a professor in college who would stand every time a girl would enter a room or leave a room. These are all things that are remnants from chivalry. For example, the holding open of the door. During this time, they would never expect a noble woman to do such work that would exhaust herself like holding open her own door. It would never happen. She would never even attempt to touch the door because they would not have her do something so common as to open her own door. There's also this idea of being honored as a woman because we all come from women. So there's this pedestal of honor that these women are on. However, this does not apply to peasants. Okay? This is only noble women. Okay? They would not honor a maidservant. If a group of men were at a table and a maidservant were to walk in, they would not stand when she walked in. It just wouldn't happen that way. Well, so let's recap. Chivalry is a direct product of feudalism. It was a code or a system of manners and morals, mostly because knights would be around people of a higher status than themselves, and they needed a code upon which to act. Okay? So, the medieval knight would be loyal to, he would have to take this like oath of loyalty, and it would be to God, to his lord, and to his lady. And those are the landowners, right? The noble people of their realm. Chivalric ideals include benevolence, which are essentially acts of kindness, brotherly love, and politeness. So these are things like, the other day, I dropped something in the classroom, and a young man picked it up for me. Even though I dropped it and it was totally my bad, he picked it up for me because he was being kind and respectful of me as a lady, and picked it up so that I wouldn't have to. Then there's the idea of brotherly love. This is what you see like in a fraternity. So even though they're not actual brothers, they feel very fondly to each other. They go through trials with each other, and they stand with each other. And that idea is very common during this time as well. And you have just general politeness. For example, like if your mom has ever gotten on to you for burping and not saying excuse me, right? Or if you've ever sat down at a fancy dinner and there's all these different utensils, specifically forks, right? And you have to use the right fork during the right time. That etiquette falls under the politeness, okay? So those are all different, I guess, categories or ideals within the code of chivalry. Now, we talked about the church, and I told you about how the church struggled at this time with hypocrisy and corruption. Now, people could not just openly talk about that, though. So there are these sins called the 7 deadly sins. And these are not like, it's not like you can go to the Bible and find a list of 7 deadly sins. These are essentially 7 deadly sins that were issued by the church. These are the 7 things that are deadly for you, right? These are the things that could cost you eternal damnation, or the actual laws that they could imprison people for or execute people for. And so if you'll look, I've put them in such an order, and if you look on your page, it spells out WASP leg. That's just a good acronym for remembering these. But you have wrath, avarice, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony. Now, remember that as I talk about these, you really want to understand that it's not simply just feeling this way, but more so acting out on feelings. So if you're a knight and another knight were to fight you, and you got the upper hand, if you wanted to kill that knight to get revenge on that knight, then that is wrath. Okay? If like I'm trying to think of something today. Like if today someone punches you in the face, but then walks away, so your life is not in danger, and then you choose to act out upon them and then beat them down. Not something equal, but like beat them down. That is wrath. You have avarice, which is actually just a fancy way of saying greed. Okay? You all understand the idea of greed. It's like wanting more, never being satisfied with what you have, specifically within material riches. Okay? Sloth. It's not really just like simple laziness, but we're talking like extreme laziness to the point of not taking care of oneself or one's family. because because they lived in a church-driven authoritarian society, they followed the teachings that were found in the Bible. And there is a verse in the Bible that says, if a man does not work, he does not eat. They very much agreed with that line of thinking, that if one were too lazy to work, he should not be helped by the church. So that would be a sin. But then you also have like characters that show up in literature during this time, like the Oxford cleric in Canterbury Tales. He's so consumed with reading books and learning that he doesn't want to get, quote unquote, a job. He doesn't want to do a job because he doesn't want to have to work. And so he was going to go into the priesthood, but he didn't. He doesn't want to work. So he has like tattered clothes, and his horse is malnutrition. He's not taking care of basic needs because he doesn't want to work, and that would be sloth. And you have pride. I don't mean like being proud of yourself or proud of your family or proud of your people. With pride, it means being too prideful to admit when one is wrong, or too prideful to admit when one needs help. This is arrogance, okay? Lust. Lust is associated with sexual desire, and in this society, any kind of sexual contact that occurs outside of the bonds of marriage is considered lust, no matter if it is a person by themselves or with another person. Any kind of sexual contact outside of marriage would be lust, and it would be punishable sometimes by death, depending on the degree. Then you have envy. This is like extreme jealousy. It's not just like, oh, I'm jealous of what you have, but this is like, I want to get what you have, and I am willing to bring you down to have yours, okay? Then you have gluttony. A lot of times people associate this only with food, but gluttony is really the overindulgence of anything. So if you're an alcoholic, you're a glutton for alcohol, okay? If you take a medicine, if you have like medicine and it makes you feel good and you take it for fun, that is gluttony of that medicine. If you overeat, that is gluttony, okay? So it's overindulgence. All right, moving on. While we're talking about the church, it's important to mention Thomas Becket. He was appointed to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it was his personal friend, King Henry II, who appointed him to this position. Now, Thomas Becket was not part of the church initially, but King Henry put him there. And we realized later on that King Henry put him there for the sole purpose of siding with him in matters between him, the king, and the church. Well, a major thing occurs, and Becket sides with the church. And then, as a result, King Henry kills him on the steps of Canterbury. And this caused a very public upset with the king. And this allowed the church to have more power and essentially more corruption. Remember, in fact, the church was even involved in helping the king access Becket in order to kill him. So, Becket, like, once he gets this position, he actually has a change of heart. Like, he wants to do good with this position of power that he has. He sees the corruptness in the church, or the corruption in the church. He sees how these priests have gold and jewels and furs, and how they're starving people that are not actually being helped. And he wants to change things. And so they're kind of almost just all too happy to help get rid of him. All right. So you have all this power from the church that because of the basically the execution or the murder of Thomas Becket, okay? But then also comes the plague, which is sometimes known as the Black Death or the bubonic plague. And this wipes out a third of the population in Europe. Okay? What happened was essentially fleas would bite rodents, and infected rodents would leave urine and feces around, which would then infect people, a lot of people, and they would contract the disease and die. Now, we have an understanding of germs and all those, and hygiene and being sanitary, but they did not. So their idea is really limited to their culture, which is God-centered. So if they don't know about germs and hygiene, then it wouldn't be odd for them to think that God was punishing people with this disease. So essentially, people are being wiped out. More people are being driven to the church, and the church is getting even more money and even more power, and it's becoming even more corrupt. But also during this time, there's an upset in the balance of the people who live there. Essentially, let's say that you are a baker, okay? If all the other bakers in the area died, then you are the sole baker, and everyone's coming to you. And since there's no competition, you can charge even more. And so maybe eventually you become a wealthy person, and you're able to purchase land. You're able to actually break that hierarchy of power and become somewhat, I'm going to say, noble. This gave the serfs, the peasants, more power, okay? Because there was a need for people of service. During this time also is going on the 100 Years' War, which is a war between Britain and France. Basically, there were a lot of kings involved in this because it was a war that took place over 100 years. But mainly Edward III and Henry V. Both of them claimed that they had the right to the throne of France. And a lot of this also had something to do with a piece of land called Aquitaine. But anyhow, they fought back and forth for years and years and years and years. And because of that, because of all the battle that was going on during this time, there was a lot of advancements made in armor and weaponry. So that's where we see like the evolution of armor becoming made out of lighter metals, but still more durable. A lot of the metalwork that happened during this time. Also, because the English got so good at longbows, like archery, there was less need for heavy, bulky armor during this time. For most part, England had control during most of it and was winning. But when all was settled, the land of Aquitaine was given back to the French. See, they had originally agreed, hey, if you will let us have this land, Aquitaine, we would like to use these resources, and in return, we will give you loyalties. And so then they decided we didn't want to let them have the land, and a war ensued. Anyhow, and if you've ever heard of Joan of Arc, she was a famous woman who claimed to speak with and see God and guided many battles. So this 100 Years' War that's occurring, she has a part in this war. That's the war that she took, or had a role in. So these are the notes for the Middle Ages, and If you need to, you can go back and listen again, or if you have any questions and would like me to explain something further, you can come see me in between class or before or after school, or you can message me on the Weebly page.